A terminally ill millionaire refuses to die alone and forces his nurse to marry him. He had already given up on life until she appeared, not to save him, but to accompany him to the end. But what was meant to be a farewell turned into a beginning, and every silence between them said more than 1,000 promises. She was quiet, firm, impossible to ignore, and he, a broken man, found himself loving just when he thought he had no time left. Because sometimes the heart chooses to love at the most improbable moment, and to love even for a short time is all that remains. From the heights of Fifth Avenue, Julian Sinclair's penthouse dominated New York City, much as he had dominated the financial markets for decades. At 48, the glass and steel of his home perfectly reflected the man, cold, impenetrable, designed to impress. The panoramic view that had cost him so many millions now seemed empty as he gazed at Central Park and the distant shimmer of the Hudson River. 3 months, maybe 4, Dr. Matthews had said that morning, in that neutral voice doctors perfect for delivering death sentences. The cancer had spread too far. There would be no miracles, not even for someone with his fortune. Julian held the medical report in his hands. The letters danced before his eyes as the sunset painted his apartment in shades of orange and purple. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built an empire, but had no one to share its end with. His 2 ex-wives had taken his money and disappeared. His brother hadn't spoken to him in years. He had no children. The chime of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. She was punctual, as always. "Send her in, Mrs. Gable," he said in a gravelly voice as his personal assistant announced the arrival. Elena Morales entered with that characteristic calm. At 42, the nurse possessed a quiet beauty she never tried to accentuate. Her crisp white uniform contrasted with her olive skin and dark hair, pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands, small but strong, held a folder with his medical records. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sinclair. How are you feeling today?" Julian watched her. It had been 3 weeks since he'd hired her, recommended as the best palliative care nurse in the city. A widow since she was young, she had raised her son alone. She never complained, never arrived late, never showed weakness. There was something in her serene dignity that intrigued him. "I'm dying, Mrs. Morales. How do you think I feel?" She didn't flinch. She was used to his outbursts. "I understand your frustration. I'll prepare your medication." "Wait." He stopped her with a gesture. "Sit down." Eleanor hesitated but obeyed, maintaining the professional distance she always kept. "Are you married, Mrs. Morales?" The question surprised her. "I'm a widow, sir, you know that. And you never remarried?" "I never found a reason to." Julian rose with difficulty and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city was lighting up below them, millions of lights that would keep shining long after he was gone. "I have a proposal for you." He turned to face her. "I want you to marry me." The silence that followed was so thick, it seemed to solidify between them. Elena blinked several times, as if trying to clear not just her vision but her understanding. "I'm sorry? It's simple. A symbolic marriage. For the time I have left." "I don't understand, Mr. Sinclair. If this is a joke—" "I don't joke about death, Mrs. Morales." His voice was dry. "I will offer you financial compensation that will secure your future and your son's. You'll be able to pay for his graduate studies at Oxford, as you've always wished." Eleanor stood, her usually calm face now a mask of confusion and a flicker of outrage. "Why me? You barely know me." Julian didn't have an answer that sounded reasonable. How could he explain that he couldn't bear the thought of the last hands to touch his being those of indifferent doctors, that there was something in her voice that soothed him when the pain consumed him at night? "You are suitable. I'm not asking for love, or even affection, just your presence." Eleanor picked up her bag, ready to leave. "You need to rest, Mr. Sinclair. We'll talk tomorrow when you're calmer." "Tomorrow I'll have one less day to live." The harshness in his voice stopped her. "I don't expect an answer now. Think about it." For 5 days, Elena didn't mention the subject. She performed her professional duties with the same efficiency as always. Julian didn't press her either. He watched her when she thought he wasn't looking, studying her precise movements, the way her small, firm hands prepared the medications, the gentleness with which she took his vitals. On the 6th day, as they had a silent breakfast, he barely touching his fruit, she having a quick coffee before checking his meds, Elena spoke. "Why a marriage? Wouldn't hired companionship be enough?" Julian put down his fork. "Marriage implies a commitment, even a fake one. And what do you get besides my constant presence, which you already have with my nursing services? He met her eyes for the first time in days. The guarantee that you won't leave when things get worse, and they will. Elena held his gaze. And if I refuse, I'll find someone else. The lie was obvious to them both. 3 days later, in Mr. Rosen's office, Eleanor signed the strangest marriage contract of her professional career. She wore a simple dark blue dress, he an impeccable black suit. There were no rings, no ceremony, just a notarized document and an obscene wire transfer to her account. "Congratulations," the lawyer said ironically, closing his briefcase. Elena and Julian looked at each other briefly, sealing their deal with a formal handshake. His fingers were cold, hers warm. Neither held on for longer than necessary. When the lawyer left, they were alone in Julian's spacious study. Outside, rain began to fall on New York City, washing away the smog and creating miniature rivers on the streets of the Upper East Side. "Now what?" Elena asked, her hands clasped in her lap. Julian stood with difficulty, the pain now a constant in his body. "Now we live, Mrs. Sinclair, for the time I have left." Neither of them mentioned the strange warmth that lingered in their hands after that brief touch. Neither admitted that in that cold, calculated formality, something invisible, indefinable, had begun to take root between them. The marriage changed everything and nothing. The penthouse remained the same, with its Italian marble floors and bulletproof glass windows. Elena continued to administer medications and monitor vitals. Julian remained the man of ice everyone knew. And yet, something had shifted. They now shared the same roof, not as employee and employer, but as husband and wife, even if only on paper. Eleanor had moved into the guest suite, a luxurious but impersonal space she now tried to make her own. A photograph of her son, Leo, now a university student, was her only personal touch. "The jasmine goes in the study, not the dining room," Julian told her the first morning, seeing her arrange fresh flowers. "And I prefer white lilies, not yellow." Elena nodded without being ruffled. "As you wish, Mr. Sinclair. You should call me Julian now, at least when people are around." "There's no one here, Mr. Sinclair." Their gazes met, defiant. He looked away first. The days passed in a strange dance of avoidance and mutual awareness. Julian would change his route through the apartment if he heard Elena in a room. He would take long detours to avoid meeting her in the hallways. And yet, when she went out for groceries or to visit her son, the penthouse became unbearably silent. "Where is Mrs. Sinclair?" he asked one Tuesday, finding Maria, the housekeeper, instead of Elena for his afternoon medication. "She went to the doctor, sir. She said she'd be back for dinner." Julian frowned. "Is she sick? Why didn't she inform me?" "I don't know, sir. She just asked me to make sure you got your pills." For the next 3 hours, Julian was a whirlwind of foul temper. He berated the gardener for pruning the balcony bonsais too aggressively. He fired his personal assistant over the phone when he was informed about a delay with some documents. He even threatened to fire Maria when she accidentally dropped a cup. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair. It was an accident," the woman murmured, picking up the fragments of fine china. Julian ran a hand over his face, suddenly exhausted. The pain was sharper when she wasn't there. "It doesn't matter, Maria. You can leave early today." When the front door finally opened, and Elena's soft-soled shoes echoed on the marble, Julian felt a relief that shamed him. He heard her put her things down, speak briefly with Maria. He forced himself to stay in his study, pretending to work on documents that no longer mattered. "Do you need anything before I turn in?" Elena appeared at the door, in her neatly pressed nurse's uniform. Even after the marriage, she insisted on maintaining that professional barrier. "Where were you?" The question came out harsher than he intended. "I had a doctor's appointment. I left precise instructions with Maria. You didn't inform me." Elena stepped fully into the study, closing the door behind her. The sunset light illuminated her profile, softening her features. "I wasn't aware I had to report my personal movements to you, Mr. Sinclair." "You don't," he replied, annoyed with himself. "I was just worried." The word hung between them, unexpected. Elena blinked, surprised. "I'm fine, it was just a routine checkup." He nodded, not knowing what else to say. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, but strangely intimate. "Would you like me to bring you some tea?" she finally offered. "Please." When she returned with the steaming mug, their fingers brushed briefly. Julian felt a shiver that had nothing to do with his illness. The contact lasted less than a second, but left a lingering sensation on his skin. The weeks moved on with a new routine. In the mornings, Eleanor prepared breakfast herself to the staff's surprise. "Mr. Sinclair needs a specific diet," she would explain, though everyone knew he barely ate before she arrived. During the day, they moved past each other like planets in orbits carefully calculated to avoid collision. He worked in his study, making video calls to his directors and lawyers. She kept the house in order and prepared his medications with her characteristic precision. It was in the small details that the tension became visible. In how Julian would find himself watching the way Eleanor arranged his pills on a silk handkerchief, ordering them by color and size. In how she noticed he had started using the aftershave she once mentioned, reminded her of her father. One evening, during the dinner they took in separate rooms, Julian heard music coming from Elena's suite, soft piano notes, a melancholy melody he vaguely recognized. He stopped outside her door, listening. When it opened suddenly, they both jumped. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought someone was knocking." "The music," he explained awkwardly. "It's Satie, isn't it?" Elena nodded, surprised. "Gymnopédie, number 1. It helps me sleep. My wife, Victoria, liked it too." It was the first time he had mentioned his ex-wife. Elena looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Would you like to come in? We could listen together." The invitation floated between them like a fragile bubble. Julian felt the urge to accept, to cross that invisible threshold. But fear was stronger. "I have work to do. Perhaps another time." Something like disappointment crossed Elena's face. So quickly he almost imagined it. "As you wish, Mr. Sinclair. Good night." The door closed softly. Julian remained there for a few more seconds, listening as the music continued on the other side. Returning to his study, the penthouse suddenly felt too large and too empty, despite knowing she was there just a few yards away. That night, as the sleeping pills began to take effect, Julian acknowledged a disturbing truth. Eleanor's presence in his home had become simultaneously uncomfortable and indispensable, like a new piece of clothing that chafes at first, but that the body learns to miss when it's gone. What had begun as a practical arrangement was transforming into something more complex, more dangerous, something no contract had prepared him for. The rainy season had arrived in New York City. Water beat against the penthouse windows like tiny, furious fists, and the sky, normally a hazy blue, had turned into a gray blanket shrouding the skyscrapers. Julian had always hated the rain. It reminded him of his childhood in Louisiana, of the leaky-roofed house where he grew up before fortune and ambition transformed him into what he was now. That morning, the pain had been particularly intense, forcing him to stay in bed longer than usual. The door to his bedroom opened without a knock. Eleanor entered hurriedly, carrying a tray with medications and a glass of water. She wasn't wearing her usual impeccable uniform, but a simple outfit, faded jeans and a light cotton blouse that had seen better days. Her hair, usually in a neat bun, fell in a loose ponytail. "Good morning," she said, setting the tray on the nightstand. "It's time for your—" "What way is that to enter?" Julian interrupted, sitting up painfully. "And what are you wearing? You look like a common maid, not the wife of Julian Sinclair." Elena stopped dead. A shadow crossed her face, but it wasn't of shame or intimidation. Slowly, she placed the glass of water on the tray and met his eyes directly. "First, I came in like that because I heard you groan in pain. I thought you needed urgent help." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Second, these maid's clothes are what I had on hand after your medication spilled on my uniform. And third, I'm not really your wife, Mr. Sinclair. I'm your nurse, with a unique contract." The silence that followed was more thunderous than the rain hitting the glass. Julian stared at her, speechless. In the 3 weeks since their marriage, Elena had never once responded to his provocations. She had never shown more emotion than a slight tightening at the corner of her mouth. "If my appearance offends you so much, I can call an agency to send another nurse, one who meets your aesthetic standards." Julian swallowed, disarmed. It wasn't the firmness of her words that unnerved him, but the dignity with which she delivered them. No shouting, no tears, no drama, just a simple, direct truth. "I didn't say that," he finally muttered. "You just surprised me seeing you like that." Eleanor gave a slight nod, but something between them had shifted. An invisible barrier had been broken. She handed him the medications, and he took them in silence, aware that he had just lost a grip on a control he didn't even know he had. From that day on, Julian began to watch her with an almost obsessive attention. He noticed how she would hum James Taylor songs, while organizing his medications, how she had a habit of lightly biting her lower lip when she was concentrating, how her small but strong hands made precise patterns when folding laundry. He tried to feign disinterest, hiding behind financial reports he no longer really read or pretending to work on his laptop. But his eyes followed her around the house, charting her movements like a cartographer mapping new territory. One afternoon, while Elena was chatting with Hector, the gardener who came every Thursday to tend to the balcony plants, Julian felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: jealousy. It wasn't a rational or justified emotion. He just saw how she smiled at the gardener, a sturdy, dark-haired man in his 30s, and felt a sharp pang in his chest that had nothing to do with his illness. "Did the gardener tell a particularly good joke?" he commented when Hector had left, unable to keep the venom from his voice. Elena looked at him surprised. "He was telling me about his daughter. She just won a scholarship to NYU. We're proud of her." "We're? I didn't realize you were so familiar with the staff." Elena put down the vase she was arranging and looked at him for a long moment. "Hector is my late husband's cousin. I've known him for 20 years. Julian felt a flush of heat rise to his face. He felt ridiculous, childish, but the unease persisted. "Well, next time have him come when I'm not here. The smell of soil he leaves everywhere bothers me." Elena didn't reply, but her look said it all. She was disappointed in him, and strangely, that hurt more than any verbal rebuke. The atmosphere in the penthouse grew thick, heavy with unsaid words. At dinner they ate in silence, separated by the long mahogany dining table that now felt like an empty battlefield. The rain continued to fall, steady as a clock, marking minutes Julian could no longer afford to waste. "Elena," he said finally, as she was clearing the plates, "can you come to my study when you're done? I need to talk to you." She nodded without looking at him. 40 minutes later, she knocked softly on the study door. When she entered, Julian was sitting by the window, watching the city lights blurred by the rain. Suddenly, all the words he had rehearsed felt empty, insufficient. "What do you need, Mr. Sinclair?" Her voice brought him back. Julian looked at her, really looked at her. The weariness in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the infinite patience with which she endured his mood, swings and petty cruelties. He was overcome by a shame he had never known before. "Nothing," he said finally. "I'm just tired." Eleanor nodded, understanding something he didn't fully grasp himself. She came closer and, to both their surprise, took a light blanket from the sofa and spread it over Julian's legs. With a gesture that seemed practiced for a lifetime, she briefly placed her hand on his forehead, as if checking his temperature. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but Julian closed his eyes, allowing himself, for the first time in years, to enjoy another person's touch, without ulterior motives, without calculations, without fear. When he opened his eyes, Eleanor was already heading for the door. "Rest, Julian," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Tomorrow is another day." The door closed softly behind her, but her presence lingered, like the scent of jasmine he now associated with her. Julian stared at the city, feeling something strange break inside him. It wasn't his sick body giving way, but something deeper, older, the control he had wielded his entire life over himself and others. And the most disturbing part was, he wasn't sure he wanted it back. The calendar in the kitchen marked another month gone. Elena noticed it while preparing the morning tea, the peppermint and lemon balm blend her grandmother had taught her to make to soothe aches. She had been living in Julian's penthouse for almost 2 months now. 2 months of this strange non-marriage, of an intimacy growing in the cracks of their professional agreement. The medical reports confirmed what she already knew from experience. The disease was progressing, faster than Dr. Matthews had initially predicted. She saw it in how Julian took longer to get up each morning, in the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands when he held documents, in the purplish bruises that appeared on his skin. But most of all, she saw it in his eyes. Those dark, proud eyes that now, when he thought no one was watching, reflected a fear no fortune could chase away. Julian refused to show weakness. He continued to dress impeccably every morning in his tailored suits and Italian silk ties. He continued to hold video conferences with his directors, giving orders as if the empire he had built would outlive him eternally. He continued to treat the doctors who came to examine him with the arrogance of a man who believed he could buy time. But Elena knew the signs. She had seen them too many times in her career. She saw how Julian clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white when a stab of pain shot through him. She heard the muffled groans that escaped his room at night when he thought she was sound asleep. One particularly difficult night, as the city slept under a starry sky rarely visible through the light pollution, the intercom by her bed buzzed urgently. "Elena." Julian's voice was strained. He said nothing more. She got up immediately, pulling a robe over her nightgown. She didn't turn on the hallway lights, knowing his eyes were sensitive. When she entered the master bedroom, she found him sitting up in bed, his back against the headboard, his pale face slick with sweat. "Do you need medication?" she asked softly, approaching him. Julian shook his head. For a moment he looked ashamed, like a child caught misbehaving. "Just stay." The request was so simple, so direct, so stripped of his usual authoritative tone that Elena stood motionless for a second. Finally she nodded and sat in the chair beside the bed. The room was in near darkness, lit only by the faint glow filtering through the windows. They remained in silence. A different silence from the ones they had shared before, which were filled with tension or unspoken words. This silence was like still water, like the calm after a storm. With a gesture that seemed to take all his courage, Julian reached his hand out to her. Elena took it in hers, feeling his cold skin and the irregular pulse beneath her fingers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The touch said more than any words ever could. The minutes stretched into hours. At one point, Elena made a motion to get up, thinking he might have fallen asleep, but Julian squeezed her hand gently. "A little longer," he murmured, his eyes closed. "Just a little longer." Something changed that night, as if an invisible wall between them had silently crumbled without scandal or drama. Elena settled back into the chair, resting her head against its back. Julian relaxed the tension in his shoulders. The room seemed suspended in a different time, separate from the world outside. "Do you know what the worst part of dying is?" Julian's voice broke the silence, so low Elena barely heard him. She looked at him, waiting. She had heard many answers to that question over her career. The pain, the fear of the unknown, the loss of control, the separation from loved ones. "It's not the pain," he continued, staring at the ceiling. "It's the loneliness. We all die alone no matter how many people are around us." Elena squeezed his hand, not interrupting. "I've been alone my whole life," he confessed, "even when I was married. Even when the boardrooms were full of people hanging on my every word. Always alone." The vulnerability in his voice was new, raw, almost unbearable to hear. This wasn't the Julian Sinclair the world knew, the corporate shark, the ruthless man who had built a real estate empire on the ruins of defeated competitors. This was simply a frightened man, facing the one battle he knew he couldn't win. "You're not alone tonight," Elena said softly. Julian looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "Why did you agree to this absurd deal? You could have said no." Elena took a moment to answer. When she did, her voice was serene. "My husband died alone in an accident on the Palisades Parkway. I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to hold his hand." She paused. "No one should have to cross that final threshold without someone to hold them." The words hung between them, heavy with truth. They spoke no more. It wasn't necessary. The silence returned, but now it was a shared, almost conspiratorial silence. Sometime during the night, Elena fell asleep, her head tilted toward the bed, her hand still intertwined with Julian's. He remained awake, watching her. The lines of worry that usually marked her face had softened in sleep. She looked younger, more vulnerable. For the first time since his diagnosis, Julian didn't think about death that night. He didn't mentally review his will or calculate how many days he had left. He simply watched Elena's serene face, listened to her even breathing, and felt the warmth of her hand in his. When the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, tinting the room a pale gold, Julian was still awake. Elena slowly opened her eyes, disoriented for a moment. Realizing where she was, she sat up quickly, but without letting go of his hand. "I'm sorry I fell asleep," she murmured, running her free hand through her disheveled hair. Julian shook his head. "Thank you," he said simply. Their eyes met, and for an instant they weren't employer and employee, millionaire and nurse, or even husband and wife by contract. Just two people holding the fragile moment of an unexpected connection. After that night of quiet confessions, something shifted between them. No grand declarations or dramatic gestures were needed. The change manifested in small details. Julian started having breakfast on the terrace instead of in his room. Elena began leaving little notes next to his medications, reminding him of things happening that day. Mr. Sinclair definitively became Julian, and the formal Mrs. Morales he'd used transformed into a simple Elena. October brought cooler days to New York City. The air cleared, allowing for a crisp view of the George Washington Bridge and the Palisades in the distance. The wisteria on the rooftop garden had bloomed exuberantly under Hector's care, creating splashes of purple and orange against the blue sky. That afternoon, after the weekly visit from Dr. Matthews, who had frowned while reviewing the latest results, Elena suggested something unusual. "We should go out to the garden. The fresh air will do you good." Julian looked up from his laptop, surprised by the suggestion. He hadn't been up to the roof in weeks. "I'm not sure I have the strength," he confessed, something he never would have done weeks ago. "Just for a moment," she insisted. "I can bring the oxygen tank in case you need it." Something in her tone, a mix of firmness and tenderness, wouldn't take no for an answer. Julian nodded. The rooftop garden was Julian's secret pride, though he would never admit it. He had designed it himself years ago when he bought the penthouse. An oasis of greenery 30 stories up, with native plants and a small koi pond. From there, the view of the city was spectacular, with the avenues stretching out like brilliant arteries and the skyline piercing the horizon. Eleanor helped him settle onto a wooden bench by the pond. The effort of climbing the stairs had left him breathless, but he refused the oxygen. He still had his pride. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is up here," he commented, breathing in the air fragrant with flowers. Elena smiled, pleased to see him more animated. She walked over to examine a bush of yellow flowers more closely. "Chrysanthemums?" she asked, touching the velvety petals. "Yes, I had them planted for autumn," Julian replied, then added with an ironic smile, "How fitting, isn't it?" Elena shot him a reproachful look. "Don't talk like that." She moved to get closer to a small lemon tree growing in a terracotta pot. As she took a step, her shoe slipped on a damp tile. She lost her balance and let out a small cry of surprise. In a reflex that stunned them both, Julian shot up and extended his arms, catching her before she could fall. The movement was so unexpected that they staggered together, their faces ending up inches apart. His hands were firm on her waist. Hers were braced against his chest. Time seemed to stop. Elena could feel Julian's heart pounding against her fingers. He could count the tiny freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose, almost invisible at a glance. Neither of them pulled away immediately. Surprise gave way to something deeper, more primal, a sudden awareness of the other as more than a name, more than a role, as a real, warm, living body, so close. "You have a scent," he murmured, his voice lower and huskier than usual. "It's hard to forget." Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't perfume, just the gardenia soap she'd always used, but she didn't correct him. The words hung between them, charged with a meaning that went beyond their literal sense. Finally, she took a step back, breaking the physical contact but not the connection that had been forged. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The blush on her cheeks spoke for her. They went back inside shortly after, claiming the air had gotten too cool. But they both knew they were fleeing something more intense than the chill. That night, they ate in the same old silence, but now it was a different kind of silence, like a wordless conversation filled with stolen glances and suppressed smiles. Elena served gumbo, Julian's favorite, though he had never told her. Somehow she just knew. The next morning, as Eleanor was preparing his medications, Julian appeared in the kitchen, already dressed in a dark grey suit and a crisp white shirt. "I have an appointment with the specialist at 11, he announced, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "Could you come with me?" Eleanor looked at him, surprised. Usually, his driver and personal assistant Rodrigo accompanied him to these appointments. "Are you sure Rodrigo could—" "I want you to come," he interrupted gently, without his usual commanding tone. It was almost a request. "Of course," she replied, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and joy. The black Mercedes navigated the city's morning traffic, driven by Rodrigo, who maintained a discreet professional silence. In the back seat, Eleanor and Julian sat beside each other, not speaking, but strangely comfortable in the shared quiet. Eleanor noticed Julian looking out the window at the familiar streets of the Upper East Side, as if trying to commit them to memory. His hands, resting on his knees, were tense. Without thinking, she covered one of his hands with hers. He looked at her, surprised by the gesture, but didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. The contact, so simple yet so intimate, seemed to communicate everything words could not. They arrived at the private clinic in the West Village, a modern building of glass and steel that contrasted with the area's historic brownstones. When the car stopped at the entrance, Julian didn't move to get out immediately. Eleanor sensed his anxiety, the fear he never admitted but that she had learned to recognize. "It's going to be okay," she murmured, gently squeezing his hand. Julian looked at her then, with an intensity that took her breath away. It wasn't the calculating gaze of the businessman, nor the irritated glare of the patient. It was the naked look of a man seeing the person in front of him, truly seeing them for the first time. "Will it?" he asked, with a heartbreaking vulnerability. Elena held his gaze. "I'm here," she answered simply. "You're not alone." Something in those words seemed to give him the courage he needed. He nodded slightly and brought her hand to his lips, a gesture as unexpected as it was moving. It wasn't quite a kiss, barely a brush of his lips against her skin, but Elena felt that small touch contained more truth than all the documents signed between them. As they walked into the clinic, they were no longer just an employer and employee bound by a bizarre contract. They were two people walking together toward the unknown, held up by something new and unnameable that had begun to blossom between them, as unexpected as the wisteria in a garden 30 stories above the ground. The news from the doctor's office was not good. Sitting in the back of the Mercedes, Julian clutched the envelope with his latest test results. He didn't need to open it again. Dr. Fernandez's words still echoed in his head with brutal clarity. "The metastasis has progressed faster than expected. The treatment isn't responding as we'd hoped. We need to consider alternatives for pain management." Time, the one luxury he had always taken for granted, was running out faster than he'd thought. Elena, sitting beside him, respected his silence. She had been in the consultation, listening with professional focus to every word, asking precise questions about medications and care. Now she occasionally glanced at Julian's tense profile outlined against the window. The city rushed by, oblivious to the private dramas unfolding inside luxury cars. When they arrived at the penthouse, Julian locked himself in his study without a word. Elena didn't try to follow him. She knew the process all too well, the rage, the denial, the need to process it alone. She let him be. The following days passed in a thick silence. Julian barely left his room, refusing the meals Elena prepared for him. He answered with monosyllables when asked about his medication. He took no calls, not even from his lawyers. It was as if he had decided to start disappearing ahead of schedule. Elena respected his space, but she watched over him. She left small offerings outside his study door, books she thought might interest him. A biography of a rival titan of industry, a collection of poetry he'd once mentioned offhand, and a mug of hot chocolate, prepared the traditional way with cinnamon and a hint of cayenne, a recipe passed down from her grandmother. They were small gestures, quiet messages that said, "I'm still here, when you're ready." One pre-dawn morning, a sound jolted her from her sleep. It wasn't loud, but a choked guttural cry of pain that cut through the silence of the penthouse. Eleanor possessed the light sleep of those who care for the gravely ill, an internal alarm tuned to the frequency of suffering. She was out of bed in an instant, not bothering with a robe over the simple white cotton nightgown she wore. The door to Julian's bedroom was ajar, which was unusual. He was a man who valued his privacy, closing doors as a matter of habit. The dim glow from a bedside lamp weakly illuminated the scene. Julian was on the floor, sprawled on the cold marble, halfway between the bed and the bathroom. His face, normally a mask of disciplined control, was contorted in agony. "Julian!" Eleanor rushed to his side, her bare knees hitting the hard floor. "What happened? Can you move?" He tried to speak, but the words were lost in a ragged gasp for air. Sweat soaked his dark silk pajamas, making the expensive fabric cling to his skin. "Can't breathe. Tried bathroom. Meds." Years of training took over, a cool wave of professionalism washing over her initial panic. With a surprising strength for her slender frame, she managed to help him, half lifting, half guiding his dead weight back onto the bed. Her hands were a blur of efficient motion. She checked his pulse, a frantic, thready beat against her fingertips. She clicked on the small penlight she always kept in her pocket, checking his pupils. They were dilated, swimming with fear. She fitted an oxygen mask over his face, the hiss of the flowing air a comforting sound in the terrifying quiet. Her hands, steady and sure, prepared an injection of potent pain relief. Her movements were precise, clinical, but there was something more than medical efficiency in her actions. There was a desperate tenderness in the way she cradled the back of his head while bringing a glass of water to his lips, in how she gently wiped the sweat from his brow with a cool, damp cloth, murmuring words of encouragement that sounded almost like a lullaby. "It's okay. It's going to pass. Breathe with me, Julian. Just breathe. I'm here. I'm not going to leave you." Slowly, agonizingly, his breathing began to even out. The frantic fight for air subsided into deeper, more regular breaths. The grey pallor of his skin gradually gave way to a semblance of his normal color, and the rigid tension in his body began to soften as the medication took hold. The acute episode was over, but they both knew what it signified: another step down a path with no return. When the crisis had fully abated, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, the adrenaline leaving her feeling hollowed out and shaky. It was then that Julian looked at her, truly looked at her, with eyes shimmering with something she had never seen in them before: unshed tears. "I don't want to die," he whispered. The voice was broken, stripped of all its power and authority. It was no longer the voice of the formidable Julian Sinclair, but simply that of a terrified man facing the inevitable. Elena felt something shatter deep inside her. It wasn't the first time she had heard those words from a patient. She had held the hands of dozens of people as they stared into the abyss, but it had never, ever hurt like this. Without thinking, without calculating the propriety of the gesture, she did what her heart commanded. She lay down on the bed beside him, on top of the covers, and took his large, cold hand in both of hers. She said nothing. There were no words for a moment like this. There was only the offering of her presence, the warmth of her body close to his, the steady firmness of her grip anchoring him to the here and now. And then it happened. Julian Sinclair, the man who never showed weakness, who had built an empire on a foundation of ruthless determination, began to cry. These were not silent, contained tears. They were deep, racking sobs that shook his weakened body, tearing through decades of repressed emotion, of loneliness, of fear. He wept for the boy in Louisiana who had watched his mother fade away, for the man who had traded his soul for success, and for the life he was now losing, just as he was beginning to understand how to live it. Elena held him through the storm. She didn't try to quiet him, didn't offer empty platitudes. She was just there, a silent witness, her arms a bastion against the terror, letting him break so that he might for a moment be whole. When the weeping finally subsided, the first blush of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky over the city. Julian, utterly spent, had fallen asleep with his head resting on her shoulder, his fingers still entwined with hers, as if he feared she might vanish into the morning mist. She remained perfectly still, listening to the soft, even rhythm of his breathing, profoundly grateful for the small miracle of this moment of peace. That night fundamentally changed them. The last mask had fallen, and neither of them had any desire to pick it up. In the days that followed, Julian began to seek her out, not just for his routine medical care, but for companionship. He wanted to share thoughts, memories, even the occasional rusty joke. "Were you always this stubborn, or is it a quality you developed specifically to torment me?" he asked one afternoon, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips as she insisted he finish the rich chicken soup she had made. "I was born stubborn," she replied, her own smile breaking through. "My grandmother used to say my first act in this world was to kick off the hospital blanket because I didn't like the color." He laughed, a real, unforced sound that had, until recently, seemed like a foreign language in the penthouse. It was a sound that seemed to warm the cool marble and glass around them. "What would Santa Fe be like this time of year?" he asked another morning, as they sipped coffee on the terrace, a shared ritual that had replaced their solitary breakfasts. "Crisp air. Sunshine so bright it feels solid. The sky would be the most incredible shade of turquoise you've ever seen," she said, her eyes distant with memory. "And the smell of roasting green chilies in the air everywhere. There's nothing like it. Take me there one day," he said. And though they both knew it was a journey he would never make, she nodded as if it were a solemn promise. Their conversations grew more personal, burrowing deeper into the soil of their lives. He spoke of his childhood in Louisiana, of an absent father and a mother who worked 3 jobs to send him to a decent school, believing education was the only way out. He told her how he built his first business, flipping parcels of swampland that barely existed on paper, and how he learned over time not to feel remorse. It was a confession, not a boast, a quiet cataloguing of the pieces of himself he had sacrificed at the altar of ambition. She, in turn, told him more about her husband, Martin, a paramedic who died trying to rescue a family from a collapsed tenement building in the Bronx after a gas explosion. She spoke of her son, Leo, brilliant and headstrong like her. And she spoke of the patients she had accompanied on their final journeys, of the lessons in courage, regret, and grace each one had taught her about the art of living. These were no longer the conversations of a nurse and her patient, nor of a contracted wife and her convenient husband. They were the dialogues of two souls who had found, in the most unlikely of circumstances, a connection that transcended contracts and conditions. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew that, paradoxically, it was the raw, unavoidable presence of death that had allowed something so beautiful and alive to grow between them, just as their time was becoming the most precious and finite of all treasures. November arrived in New York, bringing with it a characteristic mix of brilliant, low-slung sun and a crisp, biting wind. In the penthouse, the open terrace doors let in a breeze that gently stirred the curtains. It was one of those perfect autumn days the city sometimes offered after a dreary spell, the sky a deep, cloudless blue that seemed almost unreal. Julian had been having a good morning. Eleanor had persuaded him to have breakfast on the terrace, scrambled eggs with chives which she'd prepared herself, ignoring the housekeeper Maria's protests, and afterward they had spent a pleasant hour listening to old Frank Sinatra records that reminded him of his mother. For a few hours they could almost pretend they weren't living on borrowed time, that it wasn't slipping like sand through their fingers. The chime of the doorbell shattered that fragile peace. It was Mr. Rosen, Julian's lawyer, arriving unannounced, a black leather briefcase tucked under his arm, and the somber expression that lawyers practice in the mirror. "We need to talk, Julian," he said the moment he entered the room, his gaze barely acknowledging Elena. "There are urgent matters that cannot wait." Elena rose discreetly to leave them alone, but Julian stopped her with a gesture. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of my wife." The word wife, used for the first time without a trace of irony or distance, hung in the air like a declaration. Rosen raised a single eyebrow but made no comment. "It's about the will and the final estate provisions. The doctors have informed my office that we need to expedite certain legal processes." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The comfortable quiet curdled into a palpable tension, like the electric charge in the air before a lightning strike. "The doctors informed you?" Julian's voice was dangerously calm. "Without consulting me first?" "It was Dr. Fernandez who reached out," Rosen replied, pulling documents from his briefcase. "He felt it was prudent given the updated prognosis." Eleanor watched Julian's jaw tighten, saw his hands begin to tremble slightly. This was not the tremor of his illness. It was the tremor of a barely contained fury. "We have to review the provisions for the company. Your partners are concerned about the transition of power. There's also the matter of the foundation you wanted to establish and, of course, the new personal circumstances." Rosen's eyes flickered toward Elena for a fraction of a second. Julian shot to his feet, knocking over the coffee cup in front of him. The fine china shattered against the marble floor. "My partners are concerned? My partners?" His voice rose with each word, gaining a raw, ragged edge. "I'm not dead yet, damn it. You can tell them to sit on their hands and wait until I'm in the goddamn box." "Julian, please," Rosen intervened, visibly uncomfortable. "We are only being practical. There are decisions that—" "Out!" The shout echoed through the vast living room. "Get out of my house. All of you, you goddamn vultures, just waiting for me to fall so you can pick over what's mine." Rodrigo, his assistant, who had entered after hearing the commotion, tried to de-escalate the situation. Maria appeared with a cloth to clean the spilled coffee. Rosen was still attempting to reason with him, speaking of legal deadlines and fiduciary responsibilities. "Out!" Julian's voice was hoarse from shouting. His face, usually pale from his illness, was now flushed a deep mottled red with rage. "I want every single one of you out of here right now." Eleanor moved toward him, her hands outstretched, trying to calm him. "Julian, your blood pressure. You can't get this worked up." He turned on her like a cornered animal, for a moment not seeing her, only another figure in a room full of threats. "You too? Are you with them?" The accusation was unfair, irrational, born of pure fear and rage. Are you also counting the days? Calculating how much you'll get when I'm gone? Elena recoiled as if he had physically struck her. The hurt that flashed across her face was too sharp to hide. I have never given you a reason to think that of me, she said, her voice a low, wounded whisper. She turned and walked out of the room without another word. Rosen and the others departed soon after, leaving Julian alone with the shards of porcelain on the floor and the ugly echo of his own cruel words. The rage dissipated as quickly as it had erupted, leaving behind a cold, heavy sludge of shame and regret. He looked for Eleanor throughout the apartment, but she was nowhere to be found. Finally, he saw her through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was on the terrace, her back to him, her shoulders slumped. As he slid the glass door open and stepped out into the chilly air, he saw that she was crying. Not dramatic sobs, but silent, steady tears that rolled down her cheeks as she stared out at the city, beginning to ignite its lights against the early winter evening. Elena. His own voice sounded foreign to him, stripped of all its usual defenses. She didn't answer, didn't turn to look at him. I'm sorry, he continued, moving closer. I didn't mean that. I don't think that. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic 30 stories below and the occasional impatient honk of a taxi. I'm scared, Julian confessed finally, his voice barely audible. He stood beside her at the railing, gripping it until his knuckles were white. Not of the pain, not even of dying. I'm scared that all of this, he made a vague gesture, the moments with you, whatever this thing is that's growing between us, I'm scared it's come too late. Eleanor finally turned to look at him, her eyes glistening. The warm light from the apartment caught the gold flecks in her irises, making them seem luminous. I'm scared too, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I'm scared that when you're gone, I'll be left with more than just a broken contract. Julian reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. The simple, intimate gesture seemed to suspend time around them. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and covered his hand with her own, holding it against her face. He moved closer, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a calculated or premeditated act. It felt as natural as gravity, as if their bodies had decided on their own to erase the distance that separated them. Their faces were inches apart. They could feel the warmth of each other's breath. Julian's lips almost brushed hers, hovering in that infinitesimal space where desire and doubt hang in perfect balance. But then she took a tiny step back. It wasn't abrupt or dramatic, just a soft retreat that broke the spell. I can't, she whispered, her eyes still closed, as if afraid of what she would see if she opened them. It isn't right. Why? The question was genuine, with no trace of the arrogance that had once defined him. Because I don't want to be confused. Elena opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a raw honesty. I don't want to wonder afterward if any of it was real, or if it was just a part of all of this. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the penthouse, the illness, the contract that both bound and separated them. Julian nodded slowly. He didn't push, didn't press the issue. He respected the invisible boundary she had drawn, but he didn't move away, either. They remained there together on the terrace as night fell completely over the city, wrapped in a silence that spoke volumes. They weren't touching, but the connection between them was a tangible force, an invisible thread woven from shared glances, mingled breaths, and half-spoken truths. And in that kiss that never happened, in that moment suspended between longing and restraint, they both acknowledged something they could no longer deny. What they felt went far beyond any contract, far beyond any practical arrangement. It was real. And that made it both terrifying and beautiful. The days following the almost kiss passed in a strange, heightened state of normalcy. They continued their routines, shared breakfasts, medications administered on time, conversations about books and music. But something had changed. There was a new awareness between them, a hypersensitivity to each other's presence, as if a door had been opened a crack and now neither knew whether to step through it or shut it for good. Elena found her hands trembling slightly when she took Julian's temperature. Her heart would race when she heard him call her name from another room. She found herself thinking of him not as her patient or her contract husband, but as the man who had almost kissed her on the terrace, whose eyes had held a reflection of something far deeper than physical desire, and that terrified her. One morning, while Julian was sleeping deeply under the effects of a new, more potent pain medication, Eleanor made a decision. She called Catherine Suarez, a former colleague from the clinic where she used to work, an experienced palliative care nurse she trusted implicitly. "I need you to take over for me," she said, her voice low and firm. "It's a special case. The patient is complicated, but the compensation is excellent." Catherine agreed to come that same day to learn the details. When Julian awoke late in the afternoon and found the two women quietly conversing in the kitchen, his face registered a sequence of emotions. First confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a flicker of something that looked like panic, though he quickly masked it. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. Elena approached him, her professional demeanor back in place like a suit of armor. "Julian, this is Catherine Suarez. She's an excellent nurse specializing in your condition. She'll be taking over for me starting tomorrow." Starting tomorrow? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I think it's for the best. For both of us," Elena replied, avoiding his gaze. "Catherine knows all the protocols and she has more experience than I do with late-stage pain management." Catherine, sensing the immense tension, discreetly excused herself to review the chart of medications, leaving them alone. "The best for both of us," Julian repeated, a glint of his old hard-edged self returning to his voice. "Or the best for you?" Eleanor finally met his eyes. "For both of us, Julian. This is getting complicated." "Complicated," he echoed, as if the word were a woefully inadequate vessel for the storm brewing between them. "That's one word for it." "I'm your nurse," she insisted, her voice pleading with him to understand. "Hired for a specific purpose." "You're my wife," he countered. "At least on paper. A paper we signed as a service contract, not a real commitment." Julian ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly, profoundly exhausted. "Is this about what almost happened on the terrace? If I made you uncomfortable—" "It's not that," she interrupted softly. "It's the exact opposite." The implicit confession hung between them. It wasn't rejection that was pushing her away. It was the overwhelming fear of what she felt, of what they both felt. "Don't go," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice was a plea, not a command. "It's already decided," she replied, her own voice gentle but resolute. "Catherine is excellent. You'll be in good hands." He didn't argue further. His pride, though battered by illness and circumstance, was still fundamentally intact. The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze. Eleanor walked Catherine through the routines, the medications, Julian's preferences. He secluded himself in his study, pretending to work. Elena spent the afternoon packing her few belongings. She hadn't accumulated much: some books, clothes, the framed photograph of her son that was her constant companion. Her life still fit neatly into a single suitcase. The next morning came too quickly. Eleanor had arranged for Rodrigo to drive her back to her apartment in Queens at 10. Catherine was already there, ready to take over. With her suitcase standing by the front door, Elena took one last walk through the penthouse. She paused outside Julian's closed door, debating whether to say a final goodbye or just slip away. Cowardice nearly won, but she finally knocked softly. No answer. She turned the handle and stepped inside. Julian was standing by the window, impeccably dressed in a dark grey suit, a crisp white shirt, and a navy blue tie. He looked as if he were preparing for a major board meeting, not a quiet morning farewell. "You look well," she said, trying to sound casual. He turned slowly. There was a quiet resolve in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "Thank you for everything," he said simply, extending his hand just as he had the day they signed the contract. Elena took it, feeling a lump form in her throat. The handshake was brief, formal, a circle closing. She nodded, unable to speak, and turned to leave. Her hand was on the doorknob when his voice stopped her. "Stay one more day." It wasn't an order or a plea, it was an invitation, as simple as it was profound. Elena froze, her back still to him. She didn't answer. After a long moment, she walked out, closing the door softly behind her. She picked up her suitcase and said goodbye to Catherine. When Rodrigo asked if she was ready to leave, she hesitated. "Give me one moment," she said, and walked back to her former guest suite. She closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the crushing weight of a decision she didn't know how to make. What was the right thing to do? What was the professional thing? And what was it her heart was screaming at her? The night was a long vigil. Julian remained in his study. Elena stayed in her room. Neither ate dinner. When dawn began to filter through the curtains, Elena was still awake, sitting by the window. She had made a decision. She dressed slowly and walked out into the hallway. Maria was already in the kitchen. "Good morning, ma'am," the housekeeper said, surprised but discreet. Coffee? Please, Elena answered. Is Mr. Sinclair awake? A few minutes ago. He's on the terrace. Eleanor walked out onto the terrace, her heart pounding. Julian stood with his back to her, watching the city awaken. She came to a stop beside him. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as if he had been waiting. They stood in silence, watching the sun burn the morning mist off the Central Park reservoir. They didn't speak of her decision to stay. They didn't mention the suitcase that remained by the door, or Catherine, who now seemed like an intruder in a story that wasn't hers. It wasn't necessary. Something fundamental had shifted, and for now that was enough. Catherine left 3 days later. Julian paid her generously. Elena resumed her duties, but they both knew the roles had fundamentally changed. They were no longer pretending. One morning, while Elena was adjusting his IV drip, he looked at her with renewed clarity. I want you to review something with me, he said. Another legal document? She asked warily. No, something more important. That afternoon, she found him in the study. On the mahogany desk was the document she recognized instantly, their marriage contract. I want to tear this up, he announced. Eleanor stood frozen. The contract, but I thought... I don't want you here because of a signed piece of paper, he interrupted, not because of obligation or money. He took the contract and, before her astonished eyes, tore it slowly in half, then again, letting the pieces flutter into the wastebasket. What does this mean? She asked, her heart racing. It means you're free to go, and you're free to stay, for the right reasons. The implicit invitation hung between them, as vulnerable as it was sincere. Isabel nodded slowly, accepting this new, unmapped territory they were entering together. 2 days later, Eleanor found a note slipped under her door. Terrace, 8 p.m., dinner, nothing formal. When she stepped onto the terrace that evening, she stopped, catching her breath. The space had been transformed. Strings of tiny fairy lights were crisscrossed overhead, creating an artificial constellation. A table for two was set in the center with candles and fresh flowers. In the background, a small speaker played Ella Fitzgerald softly. Julian was waiting by the table, dressed simply in dark trousers and a white shirt. He looked thinner, the illness having carved new lines into his face, but his eyes held a light that the disease hadn't touched. Do you like it? He asked. It's beautiful, she breathed, genuinely moved. The dinner had been prepared by a chef Rodrigo brought in, seared scallops with a saffron risotto, her favorite dish, though she couldn't remember ever telling him. I asked your son, he explained, at her surprised look. Leo came to visit last week while you were asleep. We had an interesting talk. Elena didn't know whether to be touched or alarmed. You spoke with Leo? About what? Julian smiled faintly. About you, mostly. About how extraordinary you are. We were in agreement on that point. They ate, the glittering city spread beneath them. The conversation, easy at first, soon turned deeper. I've never really told you about me, Julian said. The real me, not the character I built. My mother died when I was 12, he began, his gaze on the horizon. She was a public school teacher in rural Louisiana. She died of cancer, like me. He paused. We didn't have money for proper treatment. My father had left years before. I promised myself then that I would never be powerless again, that money or the lack of it would never again determine my fate. The words poured out of him. I became ruthless. I bought out desperate competitors for pennies on the dollar. I made deals that destroyed people. Every dollar I made was another layer of armor against that scared little boy who held his mother's hand while she died without the care she deserved. He looked at her, his honesty raw. I built an empire, but I lost my soul. My marriages were transactions, my friendships, strategic alliances. Even when I got sick, my first instinct was to create a contract with you. And then you walked into my life with your unbreakable dignity and your kindness that was never weakness. And piece by piece you started dismantling all my defenses. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. Now it was her turn. My husband, Martin, was a paramedic, she began. We were young. We had Leo the next year. We didn't have much, but we were happy. Her voice wavered. There was a tenement fire in the Bronx. Martin went back into the collapsing building for a child trapped inside. He got the child out, but the roof came down on him. She took a breath. After he died, I promised myself I would never let myself feel that kind of pain again. I focused on Leo, on my work. I built my own walls, different from yours, but just as high. The night had grown cooler. Julian rose and draped a soft pashmina over her shoulders. "And yet here we are," he said softly. "Two people terrified of feeling anyway." The music shifted to Etta James's "At Last." "Dance with me," Julian proposed, holding out his hand. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He led her to an open space, placing one hand on her waist, their fingers intertwining. They began to move slowly, barely a sway, finding a natural rhythm. It wasn't an elaborate dance. His illness wouldn't allow it. It was a sharing of space, of air, of a single precious moment. Under the canopy of lights, their eyes met. Julian drew her closer, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When their lips met, it was with a sense of serene inevitability. The kiss was unhurried, imbued not with the fire of new passion, but with the deep, resonant warmth of mutual recognition. It was a kiss that tasted of gratitude and loss, of homecoming and borrowed time, a kiss that was, above all else, true. As the music played on, as the city glittered below them, Eleanor and Julian remained in their slow embrace, sealing not a contract, but an unconditional surrender, a new beginning in the time they had left. Winter gave way to a tentative New York spring. The cherry blossoms bloomed around the reservoir, painting the park in shades of pink and white. In Julian's penthouse, the seasons seemed to follow a different cadence, marked not by the calendar, but by the small rituals they had created. Against all medical odds, Julian had stabilized. He wasn't better, but he wasn't rapidly getting worse. Dr. Fernandez called it a plateau. Elena called it a reason to live. Their life had taken on a quiet, domestic sweetness. Every morning, Elena would find a note under her door, a line of poetry from Rilke, a simple observation about the color of the sky. In the afternoons, when the pain was bad, she would sit by his bed and sing softly old folk songs her grandmother had taught her. "No one sung to me like that since my mother," he told her once, his eyes hazy with morphine. Their love was rarely spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It was in the way he reached for her hand in the middle of the night, in the way she knew exactly how to massage the ache in his back, in the shared, knowing glances across the room. One April afternoon, sorting through papers in the study, Elena found an unsealed envelope with her name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "If I leave one day, I want you to know that you made me want to stay. And that is everything. There is no greater gift than to have the desire to live returned to you when all you were thinking about was how to die. I love you without conditions or expectations. I simply love you, Elena. And that is enough." Tears blurred her vision. It wasn't a goodbye, but it carried the weight of a final truth. She found him on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the skyline in gold and orange. "I found your letter," she said, sitting beside him. He smiled. "It wasn't hidden. Why write it now?" He took her hand. "Because some things need to be said, even if they're shown every day. And because I wanted you to know, without a doubt, what you have meant to me." She rested her head on his shoulder. "It sounds like a farewell," she murmured. "Not today," he answered, kissing her hair. "Today I'm not going anywhere. In fact, I asked Maria to make that gumbo you like." Eleanor smiled against his shoulder. "With extra hot sauce?" "With far too much hot sauce," he chuckled. "It will probably kill me, but it'll be worth it." The joke, laced with dark irony but wrapped in tenderness, made them both laugh. It was their way of taming the fear together. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared and the first stars pricked the twilight sky. "Sometimes I think," Julian said softly, "that I spent my whole life accumulating things I can't take with me. Buildings, companies, bank accounts. And in the end, the only thing that matters is this moment, being here with you." Elena lifted her face to look at him. In his dark eyes, she saw the reflection of their entire journey, the cold contract, the slow build of trust, the unexpected blossoming of love. "I love you," she said, finally speaking the words that had lived in every gesture and every shared silence. Julian's smile lit up his tired face, briefly transforming him into the vital man he must have been before. "I love you too," he replied, with the simplicity of a man who has finally discovered the only truth that matters. "And now let's go eat. I'm hungry." He rose with effort, leaning on the cane he now needed. Elena took his arm, not just to support him, but as a silent declaration. "We are in this together until the very end." As they walked slowly toward the dining room, She realized they had achieved something extraordinary. They had transformed borrowed time into a gift. Every day was a small victory against the inevitable. Every shared moment was a victory. They didn't know how many more sunrises they would have together. No one ever really does, Elena thought, with or without a terminal diagnosis. But they had learned the most important lesson. As long as there was a tomorrow, any tomorrow, there would be time to love. And that, in the end, was everything.